I hired a cleaning lady while my son and his wife were on vacation in Cabo. An hour later, she called me, her voice trembling with panic. "Sir, there is someone crying in the attic, and it is not the television." I rushed over, a sickening sense of dread growing in my stomach. When I finally broke down that heavy oak door, the smell of rot and misery hit me like a physical blow. In the shadows, a frail woman lay curled on a filthy mattress, chained to a plumbing pipe. When I turned her face toward the light, my blood turned to ice. They were hiding something terrible. It was my own daughter. It was a Tuesday morning. The Texas sun was already beating down, and I was just finishing a quiet cup of coffee on my porch. I am 73 years old. After spending my entire life building a real estate company, from the ground up, I thought I had earned a peaceful retirement. I had handed the reins of the business over to my son Nathan. He and his glamorous wife Rachel were currently sipping margaritas on a beach in Cabo San Lucas, courtesy of the generous salary I paid him. Since they were away, I decided to do them a favor. I hired Maria, a hardworking immigrant woman who had cleaned my own house for years, to go over and deep clean their sprawling mansion. I thought I was just being a helpful father. I had no idea I was about to walk into a nightmare. My phone buzzed on the patio table. It was Maria. I answered with a smile, expecting her to ask about a security code or where they kept the floor polish. But there was no greeting, just the sound of ragged, panicked breathing. "Mr. Thomas," she whispered. Her voice was shaking so hard I could barely understand her. "Mr. Thomas, you need to come right now. Please." I sat up straight, the coffee sloshing over the rim of my mug. "Maria, what is wrong? Are you hurt?" "No." She sobbed quietly, as if afraid of being heard. "I am in the hallway upstairs. The house is empty, but Mr. Thomas, there is a noise. There is someone crying. It is coming from inside the attic. The door is locked from the outside with a heavy padlock. I thought it was an animal at first, but it is a woman. She is sobbing and begging for help." My heart slammed against my ribs. I told Maria to go downstairs, lock herself in the kitchen, and wait for me. "Do not call the police yet," I told her. I did not want armed officers swarming my son's house if this was some bizarre misunderstanding. I grabbed my keys, ran to my truck, and tore out of my driveway. The drive to Nathan's estate usually takes 20 minutes. I made it in 10. My mind was racing with terrifying possibilities. Had someone broken in and gotten trapped? Was it a prank? But Maria was not the type of woman to make up stories. She was terrified. As I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turned white. My 73-year-old joints ached, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins made me feel like I was 30 again. I pulled into the circular driveway of the massive $1 million home I had helped them buy. The front door was slightly ajar, just as Maria had left it for me. I ran inside. Maria was standing at the bottom of the grand staircase, her face pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a dust rag. She just pointed up. I did not say a word. I rushed past her, taking the stairs 2 at a time, my boots pounding against the expensive hardwood. I reached the 3rd-floor landing, where the attic door was located. It was a heavy, solid oak door, completely out of place for an attic. And just as Maria had said, there was a thick steel padlock securing it from the outside. I pressed my ear against the cool wood. At first, there was only silence. Then I heard it. A low, ragged whimper. The sound of someone who had been crying for so long, they had no voice left. "Hey!" I shouted, banging my fist against the door. "I am here. Stand back. I am going to get you out." I turned and ran back down the stairs, bursting out the front door and sprinting to my truck. I rummaged through the toolbox in the bed and pulled out a heavy steel crowbar. By the time I made it back up to the 3rd floor, I was gasping for air, my chest burning. But I did not stop. I wedged the curved end of the crowbar behind the padlock hinge. I braced my boots against the wall, took a deep breath, and threw all my weight into it. The wood splintered, but the lock held. I repositioned the iron bar, ignoring the sharp pain shooting up my shoulders. I thought about the hard years I spent on construction sites, lifting beams and pouring concrete. I channeled every ounce of that old strength. I let out a loud groan and yanked the bar back with everything I had left. With a loud, violent crack, the metal bracket ripped out of the doorframe. The lock fell to the floor with a heavy thud. I dropped the crowbar and pushed the oak door open. The heat inside the attic hit me immediately, followed by a stench so horrific it made me gag. It was the smell of unwashed bodies, human waste, and chemical decay. The room was pitch black except for a thin sliver of sunlight bleeding through a boarded-up window. I fumbled for the light switch on the wall and flicked it up. A single bare bulb swung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows across the room. In the corner, on a stained and torn mattress, lay a human being. She was curled into a tight ball, her arms wrapped around her knees. She was wearing an oversized, filthy t-shirt. Her hair was matted and wild. But what made my stomach drop, what made the room spin around me, was the heavy steel chain looped around her ankle, connecting her to an exposed plumbing pipe. Surrounding the mattress were dozens of empty orange prescription bottles. "Oh my God," I whispered, falling to my knees beside her. The woman flinched, throwing her hands over her face as if expecting to be struck. She was painfully thin, her collarbones jutting out against her pale skin. "It is okay," I said, my voice breaking. "I am not going to hurt you. Who did this to you?" Slowly, she lowered her hands. She blinked against the harsh light, her sunken eyes trying to focus on my face. She let out a dry, broken sob. "Dad," she whispered. The world stopped. The breath was knocked completely out of my lungs. I stared at the hollow, bruised face of the woman on the floor. I reached out with a trembling hand and brushed the matted hair away from her eyes. It was Sarah, my beautiful, brilliant daughter, Sarah. The daughter, I had been told, was suffering from severe delusions. The daughter who for the last 4 years I believed was recovering in a luxury psychiatric clinic in Switzerland. The daughter whose medical care I had been funding with $15,000 monthly wire transfers directly to my son Nathan. I pulled her frail, trembling body into my chest, holding her as tightly as I could, while she sobbed against my shoulder. My mind could not process the nightmare I was looking at. My own son had locked his sister in an attic like an animal. He had stolen my money. He had lied to my face for years. As I sat there on that filthy floor, rocking my broken daughter back and forth, the shock slowly began to fade. In its place, something else began to rise. A dark, cold, and blinding rage. They thought I was just a clueless old man. They thought they had gotten away with the perfect crime. But they had no idea what a father is capable of when his child is harmed. I knelt on the filthy floorboards of that stifling attic, pulling Sarah closer to my chest. Her skin was ice cold despite the suffocating heat in the room. As I held my daughter, a sickening montage of the past 4 years flashed through my mind. 4 years ago, Nathan came to me with tears in his eyes. He told me Sarah had suffered a complete mental breakdown. He said she was a danger to herself and needed specialized care. He presented me with glossy brochures from an elite psychiatric facility in Switzerland. The cost was staggering. $15,000 every single month. I would have paid 10 times that amount to ensure my little girl was safe. For 48 months, I wired that money directly into an account Nathan set up, trusting my son completely. I believed I was funding her recovery. Instead, I was funding her imprisonment. I gently rested Sarah against the wall and looked around the miserable space. There were no Swiss Alps here, just exposed insulation and the stench of decay. Dozens of translucent orange prescription bottles littered the floor just out of her reach. I picked one up. The label was peeling, but I could read the name of a cheap, generic sedative. They were not treating her. They were keeping her drugged and quiet. Sarah moaned softly, her eyelids fluttering, as she struggled to stay conscious. Her lips were cracked, and her wrists were covered in dark bruises from where she had fought against the metal chain binding her ankle to the rusty plumbing pipe. My vision blurred with boiling rage. I had to get her out of here. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my heavy pocket knife. I spent the next several minutes picking at the locking mechanism on the chain around her ankle. Nathan had used a cheap padlock for the cuff itself. With a sharp twist of my blade, the rusted tumbler snapped open. The heavy chain fell away, clattering loudly against the wooden floorboards. Sarah slumped forward into my arms, completely dead weight. I needed to move fast. But then a chilling realization hit me. Nathan was obsessed with security. When I bought this house for them, he insisted on installing a state-of-the-art smart home surveillance system. There were high-definition cameras in the hallways, the living room, the kitchen, and covering the entire front perimeter. If those cameras caught me carrying Sarah out of the house, Nathan would get an instant alert on his phone in Cabo. He would panic, call his lawyers, and find a way to twist this into me kidnapping his legally incompetent sister. I needed the element of surprise. I left Sarah resting for a brief moment and crept to the top of the stairs. Maria was still trembling at the bottom of the steps. I hurried down to her, keeping my voice in a low, urgent whisper. Maria, listen to me very carefully. You did not see anything today. You did not hear anything. Do you understand? You are going to go into the laundry room and wait there until I am gone. If anyone ever asks you came here, you cleaned the floors, and you left. I reached into my wallet and pulled out every bill I had, pressing the thick stack of cash into her shaking hands. This is for your silence and for saving my daughter. Now go. Maria nodded frantically, tears streaming down her face, and hurried toward the back of the house. I closed my eyes and mapped out the house in my head. I remembered the installation plans. The cameras covered the main corridors, but there was a blind spot. If I took the back utility stairs down to the mudroom and exited through the side garage door, I could avoid the lenses completely. I ran into the master bedroom and stripped a large down comforter off Nathan and Rachel's expensive king-sized bed. I carried it back up to the attic. I wrapped Sarah completely in the thick blanket, covering her face and her fragile limbs to protect her from the harsh light and the camera angles. She weighed almost nothing, a tragic testament to how severely she had been starved. But as I lifted her into my arms, the physical strain on my 73-year-old back was immense. I gritted my teeth, ignoring the sharp pain shooting up my spine. I carried my daughter down the narrow utility stairs, taking it one agonizing step at a time. Every time a floorboard creaked, my heart stopped. I imagined the red recording light of a camera turning toward us. I kept my back pressed against the wall, sliding through the shadows of the mudroom, praying that the internet connection to the security system was slow today. I reached the side door of the garage, kicked it open, and stepped out into the Texas heat. My truck was parked near the side gate, perfectly hidden from the driveway cameras by a massive oak tree. I hurried across the grass, my chest heaving. I opened the passenger door and gently laid Sarah across the wide leather seats. I buckled her in securely. She let out a soft sigh and leaned her head against the window, her eyes completely vacant, lost in a chemical fog. I slammed the door shut and leaned against my truck, gasping for air. I climbed back into the driver's seat, started the engine, and threw the truck into gear. The facade dropped instantly. My face settled into a cold, hard mask. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator, pushing the truck faster down the desolate Texas highway. I was heading toward the private practice of Dr. Arthur Evans. Arthur was an old friend, a man I had known for 30 years. He operated a discreet, high-end medical clinic outside the city limits, catering to politicians and wealthy businessmen who needed medical attention without public records or nosy hospital administrators. Arthur owed me his career after I helped fund his practice decades ago. I knew he would ask no questions, and more importantly, he would not involve the authorities until I told him to. I looked at the rearview mirror one last time. Sarah had shifted slightly, her bruised wrist resting against the pale leather of the seat. She looked so fragile, a ghost of the vibrant woman who used to run my accounting department. Nathan thought he had won. He thought I was just a senile old man holding an open checkbook. But he had made one fatal mistake. He had left his victim alive. I turned the steering wheel sharply, navigating down a private tree-lined road that led to Arthur's secluded clinic. The grand brick building came into view. I pulled the truck right up to the private rear entrance, killing the engine. I stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching under my boots. I walked around to the passenger side and opened the door. Sarah was still breathing softly, unaware that her nightmare was finally coming to an end. I gathered her into my arms, once again holding her close to my chest, as I walked toward the heavy glass doors of the clinic. The bell chimed softly as I stepped inside. Arthur was already waiting in the hallway. We had a lot of work to do. Arthur took one look at the fragile bundle in my arms, and the professional calm on his face instantly shattered. He rushed forward, ushering me down a pristine white corridor and into a secure trauma room at the back of the facility. I laid Sarah gently onto the examination table. The sterile fluorescent lights illuminated the terrifying extent of her deterioration. Arthur did not ask any useless questions. He simply barked orders to a trusted nurse who had been sworn to absolute secrecy. They immediately started an intravenous drip to rehydrate her frail body. I stood in the corner of the room, my hands shoved deep into my pockets, watching my old friend examine my daughter. He carefully inspected the dark purple bruising around her wrists and the raw abrasions circling her ankle where the heavy steel chain had bitten into her skin. He shined a small light into her unresponsive eyes and checked her shallow pulse. Every grimace on his face felt like a dagger twisting in my gut. Arthur pulled a syringe from a sterilized package and drew a vial of dark blood from her thin arm. He handed it to the nurse and told her to run a comprehensive toxicology panel immediately. He turned to me, his expression tight, with suppressed anger, and told me it would take about an hour to get the detailed results. I spent that hour pacing the length of his private office. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock against the wall. Every tick echoed like a hammer, striking an anvil in my mind. I thought about the 4 years of holidays my son had spent at my dining table. I thought about the expensive gifts I had bought for him and his wife Rachel. I thought about the tearful toasts Nathan had given on Thanksgiving, talking about how much he missed his sister, and how bravely she was fighting her mental illness in that fake Swiss clinic. He had looked me right in the eyes, his face a perfect mask of brotherly concern, while his sister was locked away in a suffocating attic just 10 miles down the road. The level of cold-blooded psychopathy required to maintain that lie for 4 years was incomprehensible to me. I had raised a monster. I had handed him the keys to my empire, believing he was a good man, while he was slowly torturing his own flesh and blood for financial gain. The anger burning inside me was no longer a wild, chaotic flame. It was condensing into something cold, sharp, and entirely focused. The heavy oak door of the office finally clicked open. Arthur walked in holding a manila folder, his face pale and drawn. He did not sit down behind his desk. He walked straight over to me and handed me the printed report. I stared at the complex medical jargon, the numbers and graphs swimming before my eyes. I asked him to explain it to me in plain English. Arthur took a deep breath. He told me that Sarah had absolutely no underlying physiological markers of the severe schizophrenia and psychosis Nathan had claimed she suffered from. Her brain chemistry was completely normal for a woman of her age, aside from the massive, overwhelming presence of a chemical compound called zolpidem. He explained that zolpidem was a powerful sedative typically prescribed for short-term treatment of insomnia, but Sarah had not been given standard doses. Arthur pointed to the staggering numbers on the page. He said she had been systematically poisoned with heavy illegal doses of the drug for at least 4 years. They had been crushing the pills and forcing them into her system, keeping her in a perpetual state of chemical submission. The dosage was so high and so constant that her body had developed a dangerous dependency. If I had simply stopped giving it to her without medical supervision, the withdrawal could have caused fatal seizures. They had not just locked her away. They had chemically lobotomized her to ensure she could never fight back, never scream loud enough to be heard, and never tell anyone what she knew. I sank slowly into the leather chair opposite the desk, the weight of his words pressing down on my chest like an anvil. She was not sick. She was a hostage. I reached into my jacket pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out my cell phone. I opened my private banking application. The screen glowed brightly in the dim office. I navigated through the menus, pulling up the specific account history for the wire transfers I had been sending to the overseas medical facility. I scrolled through the records month after month, year after year. $15,000 here, $18,000 there for fabricated specialized treatments. I tapped the screen to calculate the total sum transferred over the last 48 months. The final number appeared in bold black text at the bottom of the screen. $842,000. I stared at that number until my eyes burned. Over $750,000. I had willingly handed over my hard-earned fortune to the very people who were torturing my little girl. They had used my love for Sarah as a weapon to bleed me dry. The fake Swiss clinic was nothing more than a bottomless pit of greed. The betrayal was so profound it transcended anger. It demanded absolute, total destruction. I closed the banking application and opened my contacts list. I scrolled past the family members and business associates until I found the name I needed. Harvey Kaplan. He was my corporate lawyer, a ruthless bulldog of a man who specialized in hostile takeovers and destroying people financially. I pressed his name and lifted the phone to my ear, listening to the dial tone. Harvey answered on the second ring. I told him we were going to war today. Harvey arrived at the clinic less than 40 minutes later. He was a man who moved with the predatory grace of a shark. He wore a sharp gray suit that cost more than most people more in a month, and his eyes were as cold and calculating as a cash register. I had known Harvey for 2 decades. We had dismantled rival development firms together. We had buried frivolous lawsuits, but we had never faced something this personal. He walked through the glass doors of the clinic carrying a thick black leather briefcase. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not offer empty sympathies. He knew that right now I did not need a friend to cry with. I needed a weapon. I led Harvey down the pristine white corridor to a private consultation room Arthur had secured for us. We sat down at a small polished table. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly. Harvey opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of financial documents, spreading them across the table. He looked at me with a grim expression. He said he had mobilized his entire team of forensic accountants the second I hung up the phone. They had traced the routing numbers from my wire transfers. The money I had been sending every month was not going to a prestigious medical facility in the Swiss Alps. It was crossing the Atlantic and disappearing into a corporate black hole. Harvey slid a piece of paper across the table. He pointed to a series of bold numbers and corporate registration details. The Swiss clinic, he explained, was a ghost. It was a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. It had no hospital beds, no doctors, and no patients. It was nothing more than a post office box and a routing number designed to launder money. I stared at the paper, feeling a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I asked him who owned the shell company. I assumed it was Nathan. I assumed my son had orchestrated the entire financial fraud to fund his lavish lifestyle. But Harvey shook his head. He pulled another document from the stack and placed it in front of me. He said Nathan was not the registered owner. The sole proprietor of the Cayman Islands account, the only person with the legal authority to move those funds, was Rachel, my glamorous, smiling daughter-in-law, the woman who hugged me every Thanksgiving and told me how much she appreciated my generosity. She was the architect of the financial theft. Harvey leaned back in his chair and explained the true depth of the betrayal. He said they had dug deeper into the banking trails. The money was not even being shared with Nathan. As far as the financial records showed, Nathan believed the money was actually paying for his sister to be kept quietly locked away. But Rachel was siphoning every single dollar of that $15,000 monthly payment into a completely separate, untraceable account under her maiden name. She was robbing me, and she was robbing her own husband at the same time. She was playing both of us for absolute fools. I asked Harvey where the money was going. I needed to know what my daughter had been tortured for. Harvey let out a short, bitter laugh. He pulled out a final folder and opened it. Inside were photographs. High-resolution surveillance photos pulled from social media and private investigators. They were pictures of a young, heavily muscled man with perfect teeth and expensive clothes. Harvey told me his name was Julian. He was a 25-year-old personal trainer who worked at the exclusive country club Rachel frequented. Harvey tapped a photograph of a sleek silver sports car. It was a brand new Porsche. He said Rachel had purchased that car 2 months ago. She paid $100,000 in cash using the exact funds she had drained from the Cayman account. She was using the money meant for my daughter to fund a lavish, secret life with her young lover. She was buying him designer watches, taking him on secret weekend trips, and financing his entire existence with the blood money squeezed from Sarah. I stared at the photograph of the silver Porsche. I thought about the rusted plumbing pipe in the attic. I thought about the cheap, generic sedatives scattered across the rotting floorboards. My daughter had lost 4 years of her life in the dark, so this parasite could buy sports cars for a boy half her age. A wave of nausea washed over me, followed immediately by a surge of pure, unadulterated hatred. I looked across the table at Harvey. I asked him what our next move was. Harvey smiled, a cold, ruthless expression that did not reach his eyes. He said we had enough evidence to go to the police right now and have them both arrested for fraud and kidnapping. But I shook my head. Going to the police right now would be too easy. It would be too fast. If they were arrested today, they would hire expensive defense attorneys. They would drag it out in court. They might even try to blame each other and strike a plea deal. I did not want them to just go to prison. I wanted to destroy them completely. I wanted to strip them of every asset, every ounce of dignity, and every shred of security they had. I told Harvey to prepare the trap. I told him we were going to let them come back from Cabo. We were going to look them in the eyes, a smile, and wait for the perfect moment to drop the guillotine. I walked back to the trauma room, where I had left Sarah in Arthur's care. The heavy door clicked softly behind me. The sterile fluorescent lights had been dimmed to a soft, warm glow. Arthur was standing near the monitors, adjusting an intravenous drip, but he gave me a reassuring nod and quietly stepped out of the room to give us privacy. I approached the bed. Sarah was no longer thrashing in a drug-induced fog. Her eyes, though framed by dark, sunken circles, were finally clear and focused. She was looking at me. For a long moment, neither of us said a single word. The silence in the room was heavier than anything I had ever felt. Then a single tear escaped the corner of her eye and rolled down her pale cheek. She tried to lift her hand, trembling with the effort, and reached out toward me. I rushed forward, dropping into the chair beside her bed, and wrapped both of my hands around hers. Her fingers were so fragile, so incredibly cold. "Dad," she whispered, her voice a raspy, broken breath. "You came for me. You actually came." I pressed my face against her knuckles, letting the tears I had been fighting for hours finally fall. "I am so sorry, sweetheart." I choked out, unable to control the tremor in my chest. "I am so sorry, I did not know. I thought you were sick. I thought they were helping you. I should have known. I should have protected you." Sarah squeezed my fingers weakly. "You could not have known, Dad. They planned it so perfectly." I sat up, wiping my face, and looked at her. The sadness in my chest was quickly being replaced by that familiar burning need for answers. I needed to know the missing piece of the puzzle. I needed to know what drove my own son to commit such unspeakable evil. Sarah, why did they do this to you? Why did they lock you away instead of just stealing the money from me? Sarah closed her eyes, taking a slow, painful breath as the memories flooded back. It was never about the clinic money, Dad. That was just Rachel being greedy. This was about the company. It was about the pension fund. I stared at her confused. The pension fund? 4 years ago, Sarah had been the brilliant head accountant of my real estate empire. She oversaw every major transaction. She opened her eyes, and the old spark of sharp intelligence flickered within them. 4 years ago, Nathan came to my office. He told me he was moving some assets around for a new commercial development, but the numbers did not add up. I stayed late one Friday night and dug into the encrypted server. I found a hidden ledger. Nathan had not just moved assets. He had taken out a massive $10 million loan against the company pension fund, the fund that held the retirement savings of every single person who had worked for you for the last 30 years. My heart stopped beating. $10 million. That would bankrupt the entire foundation of the company. I asked her how he could possibly do that without my authorization. He forged your signature, Dad. He used the company seal and fabricated a board resolution. I printed everything out. I had all the proof. I called him and told him I was going straight to you the next morning to expose him. That was my biggest mistake. I should have just gone straight to your house. Instead, I gave him warning. What happened next? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Sarah shuddered, a look of pure terror crossing her face. He came to my apartment that night. He brought Rachel. They told me they wanted to explain, to beg for my forgiveness. Rachel handed me a cup of tea. I was so stressed, so exhausted, I drank it without thinking. 10 minutes later, the room started spinning. I could not stand. I could not speak. The last thing I remember before waking up in that attic was Nathan standing over me, taking the printed files from my hands and telling Rachel to go get the car. I felt physically sick. My son had poisoned his own sister to cover up a $10 million financial crime that would destroy the lives of hundreds of innocent employees. He had stolen the futures of the men and women who had built my company brick by brick. And he had buried the only witness in a dark attic, slowly eroding her mind with sedatives, so her testimony would never hold up in court. He told everyone you had a psychotic break, I said, the pieces finally snapping together in my mind. So even if you somehow escaped, no one would believe a word you said about the stolen money. Exactly, Sarah whispered. I was a certified lunatic in the eyes of the law. But Dad, listen to me. She gripped my hands with a sudden, desperate strength, her eyes wide with panic. You cannot just go to the police yet. You do not understand the timeline. What timeline? I asked, leaning closer. They are coming back early, Dad. I heard them talking outside the door before they left for Cabo. Nathan lost the $10 million in a series of catastrophic cryptocurrency investments. He is completely broke and the bank is threatening to call in the loan. He needs absolute control of the company to liquidate the remaining assets and cover his tracks before the federal auditors arrive next month. He is cutting the vacation short. He is flying back here tomorrow morning, and he is going to tell you that he is worried about your health. He will try to use my fake illness as a reason to take control. He wants you to sign the power of attorney this Friday. If you sign it, he liquidates the company and leaves with everything. I sat perfectly still, the weight of Sarah's words settling over me. If you sign it, he liquidates the company and leaves with everything. The sheer scale of his treason was almost too massive to comprehend. He was preparing to annihilate the livelihoods of hundreds of families who had trusted me for decades, all to cover his own colossal failures. If I called the police right now, Nathan would be alerted the moment the squad cars pulled into his driveway. He would immediately wipe the servers and destroy the original forged documents. And with Sarah's fabricated medical history, His expensive lawyers would spin a narrative that she was a deeply disturbed woman making wild accusations. He might get charged for locking her up, but the $10 million would vanish forever, and my company would be burned to the ground. I could not let that happen. I looked down at Sarah. Her eyes were wide, filled with a desperate, lingering terror. "You are going to stay right here with Arthur. You are going to rest, recover your strength, and prepare yourself. When we drop the hammer on your brother, I want you standing right next to me." The grief that choked me all morning evaporated, replaced by cold vengeance. I was no longer just a father. I was a businessman, protecting his empire, and I was going to utterly dismantle the traitor from the inside out. I left the clinic and climbed into my truck. I needed to buy myself time. If Nathan and Rachel returned tomorrow morning and found the attic empty, they would instantly know they had been discovered. They would panic and run. I needed them to believe that their carefully constructed nightmare had simply unraveled on its own. I needed them to think Sarah had finally lost her mind, broken out of her cage, and vanished into the wind. I drove toward the edge of town and pulled into the parking lot of an old butcher shop. The bell above the door jingled as I walked inside. I bought a cut of raw beef liver. I paid in cash and walked back to my truck, my mind mapping out the deception I was about to create. I drove back to Nathan's sprawling estate, taking the same back roads to avoid the perimeter security cameras. I parked under the massive oak tree, perfectly concealed, and slipped through the side garage door. Maria had finished cleaning and gone home following my instructions. I walked through the immaculate air-conditioned hallways carrying the package of raw meat. The contrast between the luxurious downstairs and the horror hidden above made me sick. I climbed the stairs, my boots making no sound on the thick carpet, until I reached the attic door. The heavy oak frame was still splintered from where I had forced it open with the crowbar. I pushed the door open and stepped into the suffocating heat of the prison. I walked over to the small, boarded-up window at the far end of the room. It was the only source of natural light, covered by thin wooden slats that Nathan had hastily nailed into the frame. I picked up a heavy wooden chair sitting in the corner. I swung it backward and smashed it through the glass and wooden slats. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the empty house. I used the chair leg to knock out the jagged edges, creating a hole just large enough for a starving woman to squeeze through. The drop to the roof below was steep, but entirely survivable. I reached into my bag and unwrapped the bloody cut of meat. I put on leather work gloves from my pocket. Carefully, methodically, I began to stage the scene. I smeared blood across the jagged edges of the broken window frame, making it look as though she had cut herself deeply while forcing her way out. I dripped blood onto the dusty floorboards, creating a desperate trail leading from the broken pipe directly to the shattered window. I let a few drops splatter onto the torn mattress. I picked up the heavy steel chain and broken padlock. I arranged them to look as though someone in sheer panic had managed to pry the rusted tumbler apart with a piece of scrap metal. I stepped back slowly. It looked like a crime scene. It looked like a violent, unpredictable escape. When Nathan and Rachel walked up those stairs tomorrow, they would not see the calculated rescue of an angry father. They would see the chaotic aftermath of a woman who had finally snapped under the weight of the sedatives. They would believe she was bleeding, terrified, and running blindly through the streets. The paranoia would consume them. They would not be able to call the police to report a missing person, because doing so would expose their own crimes. They would be forced to keep quiet, to act normal, and to try and push their financial scheme forward before the imaginary ticking clock ran out. I took the remaining meat, wrapped it back in the bloody paper, and shoved it deep into a heavy trash bag I had brought with me. I took off my gloves, making absolutely sure I had left no fingerprints, no footprints, and no trace of my own presence in the room. I walked out of the attic, pulling the splintered door shut behind me to make it look as though it had been violently forced from the inside. I walked down the stairs, slipped out the side door, and drove away from the mansion just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The trap was perfectly set. All I had to do was wait for the rats to come home. Tomorrow I would look my son in the eye, and I would play the role of the frail, senile old man. I would let him think he was winning right up until the moment I destroyed his entire world. The next afternoon, the familiar sound of tires crunching on gravel echoed through the quiet Texas air. I was sitting in my worn leather armchair by the front window watching as Nathan pulled his heavy luxury SUV into the driveway. The Texas sun glinted off the polished black paint. They stepped out of the vehicle laughing together, as if they did not have a care in the world. Their skin was glowing with fresh, expensive tans from the Mexican sun. Rachel was wearing a designer sundress, adjusting her oversized sunglasses, while Nathan casually pulled matching leather luggage from the trunk. Looking at them, you would think they were the perfect, successful young couple. You would never guess the absolute darkness rotting inside their souls. I stayed seated in my chair, taking a deep, steadying breath. It was time for the performance of my life. I waited until they walked through the front door. "Dad, we are home," Nathan called out, his voice practically dripping with artificial warmth. I slowly pushed myself up from the armchair. I made sure my knees wobbled just a fraction. I hunched my shoulders forward, losing the confident posture that had defined my entire career, and let my hands begin a subtle, continuous tremor. I shuffled out into the hallway to meet them. "Oh, there he is," Rachel chimed in, rushing forward to wrap her arms around me. She smelled like expensive sunscreen and deceit. "We missed you so much, Thomas. It just was not the same without you there." She pulled away and handed me a small, brightly colored wooden turtle. "We saw this at a local market and thought of you." A cheap piece of painted wood to placate the old man while they drained his life savings and tortured his daughter. I took the wooden turtle with both hands, letting my fingers fumble clumsily against the shell. "Thank you, Rachel," I said, making my voice sound thin and reedy. "It is beautiful. Did you say you got this in Florida?" Nathan exchanged a quick, knowing look with his wife. The corner of his mouth twitched upward into a smug, satisfied smile. "No, Dad," Nathan said, speaking to me slowly and loudly, as if I were a confused child. "We went to Cabo, in Mexico. Remember? We talked about it on the phone yesterday." Right, Cabo," I muttered, tapping the side of my head with a trembling finger. My memory is just playing tricks on me these days. Sometimes I walk into the kitchen and completely forget why I am even in there. Getting old is not for the faint of heart, kids. Nathan stepped forward and placed a heavy, reassuring hand on my shoulder. His grip was a little too tight, a subtle assertion of dominance. "Do not worry about it, Dad. That is exactly why we came back a few days early. We wanted to check in on you. Make sure you are taking care of yourself. You have been running the company and carrying so much weight for so long. Maybe it is time you finally start resting." His words were carefully chosen, laying the groundwork for the legal trap he planned to spring on me later that week. I simply nodded, looking down at the wooden turtle playing the part of the weary patriarch who was finally ready to surrender his crown. I had prepared a simple dinner for us. We sat around the large mahogany dining table, the same table where Sarah used to sit, and helped me review financial statements years ago. I intentionally poured my glass of ice water with a shaking hand, letting a generous splash of the cold liquid spill across the polished wood and onto my own lap. I gasped softly, fumbling with my napkin to wipe it up, acting flustered and embarrassed. "Let me help you with that, Thomas," Rachel said smoothly, reaching over to dab at the spilled water. She cast another glance at Nathan. It was a look of pure, predatory triumph. They were buying every single second of my performance. They genuinely believed my mind was deteriorating, that my sharp business instincts were finally dissolving into senility. They thought I was an easy mark. Nathan casually cut into his steak, keeping his tone light and conversational. "So, Dad," he began, his eyes fixed on his plate. "Have you given any more thought to the paperwork I mentioned before we left? The power of attorney documents. I know you hate dealing with lawyers, but with the market fluctuating the way it is, I really need the legal authority to execute those commercial property transfers quickly. It would just take so much stress off your plate. I kept my eyes focused on my trembling hands. I will look at them, son, I promised weakly. I just get so confused with all the legal jargon lately. You will have to sit down and explain it all to me on Friday. Nathan smiled, raising his wineglass to his lips. Of course, Dad. Whatever you need. As the dinner wound down, the atmosphere in the room grew noticeably tense. Rachel kept checking the diamond watch on her wrist. I knew exactly what she was thinking about. They had been gone for days. She needed to go upstairs to the attic to check on her prisoner. She needed to force more crushed pills down her throat to keep her compliant. Rachel gracefully wiped her mouth with her napkin and pushed her chair back from the table. The meal was wonderful, Thomas, she said, offering me another brilliant, entirely hollow smile. But the flight really took it out of me. If you do not mind, I am going to run upstairs and start unpacking our suitcases. Of course, dear, I replied, offering her a tired, grandfatherly nod. You go right ahead. Nathan and I can finish up down here. Rachel turned and walked toward the stairs. I listened as she approached the heavy attic door. I sat at the dining table nursing my glass of water, my ears straining to track every sound. Rachel's heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood stairs, growing fainter as she ascended to the third floor. Nathan was busy pouring himself another glass of expensive red wine, completely oblivious to the trap that was about to snap shut. I kept my face slack, mimicking the empty stare of an old man, but underneath the table my pulse hammered. I counted the seconds. I knew exactly what she was seeing. I visualized her walking down the hallway. I imagined her reaching into her purse for the iron key. But the padlock was not there. It was lying broken on the floorboards. Suddenly the rhythmic clicking of her heels stopped entirely. A heavy, suffocating silence descended over the upper levels. I imagined her pushing the splintered oak door open. I pictured her standing in the threshold, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. She would be looking at the empty mattress. She would see the heavy steel chain lying uselessly on the ground, the broken window framing the twilight sky, and the dark trails of blood I carefully painted. The realization that her captive had violently broken free would hit her like a freight train. A sharp, muffled gasp echoed down the stairwell. It was followed immediately by the chaotic sound of someone running. The confident clicking was gone, replaced by the desperate thudding of bare feet as Rachel scrambled down the carpeted stairs. She practically fell into the dining room, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her pristine composure had completely evaporated. The expensive tan she cultivated in Mexico vanished, leaving her skin a sickly gray. Her eyes were wide, darting wildly around the room, as if she expected a monster. Her hands shook so violently that her diamond rings clinked together. Nathan looked up from his wineglass, an annoyed expression crossing his face. Rachel, what is wrong with you? He asked, clearly irritated by her sudden lack of grace. Did you see a spider? Rachel did not answer. She grabbed him by the arm, her manicured nails digging deep into his expensive shirt, and practically dragged him out of the dining room and into the kitchen. She pushed the swinging door shut behind them, but the house was too quiet, and their panic was too loud. I remained seated at the table, leaning my head slightly toward the kitchen. Through the heavy wood, I could hear the venomous hissing of their whispered argument. She is gone, Rachel gasped, her voice trembling with raw terror. The chain is broken. The window is smashed. There is blood everywhere, Nathan. What are you talking about? Nathan hissed back, the annoyance in his voice instantly morphing into panic. That is impossible. The lock is industrial steel. She could not break it. Well, she did, Rachel sobbed. She smashed the window and climbed out. We have to call the police. We have to find her before she talks. Are you insane? Nathan shot back, his whisper turning into a vicious snarl. We cannot call the police. What exactly are we going to tell them? Hello, officer. Someone broke into our attic and stole the woman we have been keeping chained to a pipe for 4 years. If the cops see that room, if they see those pill bottles, we are going to federal prison. We cannot involve the authorities. We have to handle this ourselves. I closed my eyes, savoring the delicious sound of their crumbling empire. They were trapped in a cage of their own making. They could not report the escape without confessing to kidnapping, drugging, and torturing my daughter. They had no idea where Sarah was. They had no idea if she was wandering the streets bleeding or if she was sitting in a police precinct telling a detective everything. The paranoia was eating them alive. They had assumed total control, but now they were stumbling blindly in the dark, terrified. The kitchen door swung open. Nathan walked back into the dining room. It was a masterclass in deception. He smoothed back his hair, straightened his shirt collar, and forced his face into a mask of deep concerned solemnity. He tried to hide the absolute terror radiating from his eyes, but I could see sweat glistening on his forehead. Rachel stayed huddled in the kitchen, completely unable to face me. Nathan pulled his chair out and sat down heavily, leaning across the table to look me directly in the eyes. "Dad," he said, his voice dropping an octave to convey a sudden gravity. "I need you to stay calm, but we have a very serious situation on our hands." I let my jaw drop slightly, letting my hands resume their trembling. "What is it, Nathan? What happened?" "Rachel is fine, Dad, but the house is not," Nathan said, placing his hand over mine in a sickening display of false comfort. "While we were gone, someone broke into the house. They smashed a window upstairs and made a huge mess. It looks like a vagrant got inside. There is blood on the floor." I gasped aloud, clutching my chest as if the shock was too much for my frail heart. "Oh my Lord. A break-in. We have to call the police, Nathan. We have to call 911 right now." "No. Dad, listen to me." Nathan interrupted quickly, his grip on my hand tightening painfully. "We do not want to involve the police right now. They will turn the house upside down. It will be a media circus, and it will just cause you unnecessary stress. I am going to have my private security team handle it quietly. But this proves what I have been saying all along. It is not safe anymore. You are getting older, and the world is getting dangerous. I cannot protect you and work. You need to sign the company over to me tonight." I looked at him, letting my eyes widen in manufactured terror. "Tonight," I repeated, my voice shaking. "But Nathan, it is almost midnight. Surely this can wait until the morning. I am so tired, and my heart is beating so fast from all this awful news." Nathan shook his head, his face a mask of grim determination. He stood up from the dining table and walked briskly over to his leather briefcase resting near the hallway entrance. He snapped the brass latches open. The sound echoed loudly in the quiet house. "No, Dad." "It cannot wait until the morning," he said, pulling out a thick stack of legal documents bound in a dark blue folder. "Whoever broke in upstairs might come back. They might have been looking for the safe or looking for you. If something happens to you and the company assets are not legally transferred, the state will freeze everything. We could lose the entire legacy you built. It is my job to protect this family now, but I cannot do that unless you give me the authority." He walked back to the table and dropped the heavy folder directly in front of me. The title page read, "General Durable Power of Attorney," in bold black letters. My stomach turned. He was using the very nightmare he created to corner me. He was weaponizing my supposed fragility to steal the last remaining piece of my life work. I stared at the paperwork, letting my hands hover nervously over the pages. Rachel was still completely silent in the kitchen, undoubtedly pacing the floor in a cold sweat, terrified that Sarah was out there in the dark. Nathan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek, heavy gold pen. He uncapped it and aggressively pushed it into my trembling right hand. "Just sign on the dotted lines, Dad," he urged, his voice dropping into a soft, hypnotic cadence. "I have already highlighted the signature blocks in yellow. It will take 2 minutes, and then you can go upstairs and get a good night of sleep. I will hire armed guards to stand outside your door if it makes you feel better. Just sign it." I held his expensive gold pen. My fingers slipped awkwardly against the smooth metal. I let out a frustrated sigh, deliberately allowing my grip to falter. The gold pen slipped from my grasp, clattering loudly against the polished mahogany table and rolling off the edge. It hit the hardwood floor and spun under the heavy dining chairs. "Oh, I am so clumsy," I muttered, patting my chest in distress. "My arthritis is just terrible tonight. I cannot seem to hold on to anything." Nathan closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, struggling to hide a flash of pure, venomous impatience. "It is fine, Dad," he said through gritted teeth, bending down to look under the table. "Let me just get it." While he was hunched over out of sight, I reached into the breast pocket of my cardigan. I pulled out my own pen. It looked ordinary, just a standard plastic ballpoint, but it was the weapon Harvey and I had carefully prepared. Harvey had instructed me to use a very specific shade of blue ink manufactured by a boutique company in Europe, an ink that our legal team could instantly identify in a forensic audit. Furthermore, he told me exactly how to sign the document. For 40 years, my legally binding signature on every corporate contract had been Thomas Edward Harrington. Harvey told me to sign these documents as Thomas E. Harrington, omitting the full middle name, and to intentionally break the loop on the letter H. Under Texas corporate law combined with a pre-existing notarized affidavit, I had secretly filed with Harvey that morning, stating I was under duress. This specific signature would render the power of attorney absolutely null and void. It was a poison pill dressed up as a surrender. Nathan popped back up from under the table holding his gold pen. Before he could offer it to me again, I clicked my cheap plastic pen. "I found one in my pocket," I said, offering him a weak, apologetic smile. "I will just use this one. I am more used to the grip." Nathan waved his hand dismissively. "Fine, Dad. Just use whatever you want. Just sign the papers, please." I leaned heavily over the document. I made a show of breathing heavily, leaning my weight against the table as if the mere act of writing was exhausting. I slowly brought the sharp tip of the dark blue pen to the very first highlighted line on the page. I let my hand shake violently for a moment, and then I signed. Thomas E. Harrington. I made absolutely sure to leave the loop of the letter H completely open. I slowly flipped over to the next page, my breathing ragged and loud in the silent room. I signed the second line, then the third. There were 6 signatures required in total. With each stroke of the pen, I was handing my son a loaded weapon that was rigged to explode directly in his face. He stood over my shoulder, watching the blue ink bleed into the heavy paper, completely unaware that he was witnessing his own destruction. Finally, I reached the very last page of the stack. I scribbled the final flawed signature and let the pen drop from my hand, leaning back in my chair with a heavy, dramatic sigh. "It is done," I whispered, sounding utterly defeated. Nathan snatched the documents off the table before the ink was even fully dry. He quickly flipped through the pages, verifying that every single yellow box had been filled. A slow, sickening smirk spread across his face. The tension vanished from his shoulders. He looked at me, his eyes gleaming with triumphant greed. "Thank you, Dad," he said softly, packing them away. "I will take care of everything from here." The morning sun crept through the large bay windows of the mansion, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. Nathan left for the corporate office earlier than usual. He was vibrating with a smug, arrogant energy, holding the dark blue folder tightly under his arm. He thought he possessed the keys to the kingdom. He thought he had outsmarted everyone. After the heavy oak front door clicked shut behind him, the house descended into an uncomfortable, suffocating silence. Rachel was sitting at the kitchen island, nursing a cup of black coffee. She looked absolutely wretched. The stress of the missing prisoner was eating her alive from the inside out. Her usually perfect hair was tied back in a messy knot, and dark, exhausted circles framed her bloodshot eyes. She jumped slightly when I shuffled into the kitchen, leaning heavily on my wooden cane. I poured myself a glass of orange juice, letting my hand tremble just enough to slosh a few drops onto the granite countertop. "Good morning, Rachel," I said, keeping my voice gentle and frail. "You look very tired, my dear. Did you not sleep well?" She forced a tight, brittle smile, gripping her coffee mug with white knuckles. "Just jet lag, Thomas," she lied smoothly. "The time difference is catching up to me." I nodded sympathetically, taking a slow sip of my juice. I pulled out a stool and sat across from her. I let a few minutes of quiet pass, allowing her anxiety to simmer in the silence. Then I began my psychological warfare. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a fake credit card statement Harvey had mocked up for me, but it looked incredibly official. "You know, Rachel," I began, my tone perfectly conversational and innocent, "I was looking through some of the mail that arrived while you two were in Mexico. I think the bank made a terrible mistake on your credit card statement." Rachel stiffened. Her eyes darted to the folded paper in my hand. "What do you mean, Thomas?" I unfolded the paper, slowly squinting at the fine print as if my eyesight was failing me. "Well, there is a massive charge on here from a luxury auto dealership. It says something about a down payment for a silver Porsche. Now, I know Nathan prefers his heavy sport utility vehicles, and you already have that beautiful Mercedes in the garage. I figured someone must have stolen your credit card information. We should probably call the fraud department right away." The color completely drained from Rachel's face. She looked like she had just been struck by lightning. The silver Porsche was her secret. It was the physical proof of the money she was stealing from her husband and the lavish affair she was hiding. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She swallowed hard, her eyes wide with sheer panic. "No," she finally stammered, reaching across the island and snatching the paper from my hands. "Do not call the bank, Thomas. I mean, it is not a mistake. I bought it as a surprise. A surprise anniversary gift for Nathan. He has always wanted a vintage sports car. Please do not tell him. It is supposed to be a secret." I smiled warmly, patting her trembling hand. "Oh, what a wonderful wife you are. My lips are completely sealed. I will not say a word to Nathan." The relief that washed over her face was palpable, but I was not done with her yet. I leaned back in my chair, letting my expression shift into one of mild, grandfatherly confusion. "I just hope Nathan is not keeping any financial secrets from you, Rachel. A marriage needs absolute trust to survive." Rachel frowned, her paranoia instantly reigniting. "What do you mean by that?" I sighed, rubbing my forehead, as if trying to recall a distant, foggy memory. "Well, when Nathan was showing me those corporate documents last night, I noticed some strange transfer forms mixed in with the paperwork. He was moving a very large sum of money, $10 million to be exact. He was transferring the entire company pension loan into a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands." Rachel froze. The coffee mug in her hand trembled violently. The Cayman Islands. I nodded slowly, maintaining my facade of innocent concern. "Yes, that is what it said. But the strange thing was, I only saw his name listed as the sole beneficiary on the new account. I asked him why your name was not on the offshore trust. He just brushed it off, said it was complicated tax structuring, and told me not to worry about it. But you know how these things go, Rachel. When a man starts moving millions of dollars into accounts without his wife's name on them, it usually means he is preparing for a sudden exit. I just want to make sure you are protected, my dear." I stood up from the stool, leaning heavily on my cane, and gave her one last sympathetic look before shuffling slowly out of the kitchen. I left her sitting there in the deafening silence. The seed of absolute paranoia had been planted, and I knew it was already blooming into a toxic, consuming fear. Rachel was not stupid. She knew the walls were closing in on them. Sarah was missing and could go to the police at any moment. The authorities would find the broken attic, the chains, and the medical records. The financial records proved she owned the fake Swiss clinic. She was legally responsible for the extortion. Now she believed Nathan was moving the money into an account she could not touch. The horrifying realization crashed down on her. Nathan was not trying to save them both. He was preparing to take the money and vanish, leaving her completely alone to face federal prison for a kidnapping he orchestrated. She was going to be left holding the bag. That night, the atmosphere in the mansion was heavier than a wet wool blanket. Nathan returned from the corporate office late, claiming he had back-to-back meetings. Rachel barely looked at him during dinner. She picked at her food, her eyes darting nervously toward the front door every time a car drove past the estate. I excused myself early, playing the part of the exhausted old man, and retreated to the guest bedroom on the ground floor. I closed my door, turned off the overhead light, and waited in the darkness. I sat in absolute silence for 3 hours, listening to the muffled sounds of the house settling around me. Around 1 a.m, I heard the heavy footsteps of my son ascending the main staircase, followed shortly by the quiet click of the master bedroom door shutting. The house was finally completely asleep. I slipped out of my bed, fully dressed. From the bottom of my suitcase, I pulled out a small black velvet pouch. Harvey had sent it over by a private courier earlier that afternoon. Inside were 3 state-of-the-art voice-activated hidden microphones. They were smaller than a dime, designed for corporate espionage, capable of picking up a whisper from across a large room. I opened my bedroom door and crept down the hallway, my socked feet making absolutely no sound against the polished hardwood floor. I moved like a ghost through the home I had paid for. I walked into the massive sunken living room, the central hub where Nathan and Rachel usually sat to drink their expensive wine and discuss their day. I placed the first microphone underneath the lip of the heavy marble coffee table, securing it with the industrial adhesive backing. I attached the second microphone behind the thick velvet drapes near the floor-to-ceiling windows. I pressed the third one firmly onto the underside of the ornate wooden mantelpiece above the grand fireplace. I double-checked their positions, ensuring they were completely invisible. I pulled a small digital receiver from my pocket, plugged in a pair of wired earphones, and tested the frequency. The faint hum of the air conditioning unit instantly filled my ears with crystal-clear precision. The trap was armed and ready. I returned to my room, locked the heavy wooden door, and sat on the edge of my mattress, waiting for the inevitable explosion. I did not have to wait long. The next evening, the toxic tension that had been boiling beneath the surface finally erupted. Nathan walked through the front door just after 8 o'clock. I was already safely in my room with the earphones pressed tightly into my ears. I heard the sharp clink of a glass being slammed down violently on the marble coffee table. "Where were you?" Rachel demanded. Her voice was sharp, brittle, and echoing perfectly through my receiver. "I told you I was at the office," Nathan replied, his tone dripping with condescension. "I am trying to save our lives, Rachel. The auditors are breathing down my neck. The bank is threatening to call in the margins on the properties, and we have a missing hostage who could blow this entire thing wide open at any second. I am working." "You are a liar," Rachel screamed. The sheer volume of her voice made me wince, but I reached down and hit the red record button on the digital receiver. "I know exactly what you are doing behind my back. You are not trying to save us. You are trying to save yourself." I saw the transfer documents, Nathan. I know about the $10 million in the Cayman Islands. I know my name is not on that account. There was a sudden, chilling silence in the living room. I could almost hear Nathan calculating his response. "You went through my private briefcase?" he asked, his voice dropping into a dangerous whisper that sent shivers down my spine. "Do not try to turn this around on me," Rachel fired back, her panic fueling her escalating rage. "You were going to take the money and run. You were going to leave me here to take the fall for Sarah. If the police find that attic, they are going to arrest me. You forged your father's signature on the pension loan, Nathan. You stole $10 million from the company, and you poisoned your own sister to cover it up. If you try to leave me behind, I swear to God I will go to the authorities right now and I will give them everything. I will tell them exactly what you did to her." A cruel, vicious laugh erupted from Nathan. It was a sound devoid of any human empathy. "You think you have leverage over me, Rachel? You think you are the innocent victim here? Do you honestly believe I am that stupid? What are you talking about?" She stammered, her fragile confidence suddenly faltering. "You think I do not know about the Swiss clinic?" Nathan snarled, his voice rising in pure fury. "You think I did not run a quiet audit on where my father's money was actually going every month? $15,000 a month for 4 entire years, Rachel. You set up a fake shell corporation. You stole nearly $1 million right out from under me. And worse, you used it to buy a brand new silver Porsche for a 25-year-old personal trainer who flexes in the mirror at the country club. Do not you dare stand there and threaten me with the police." I sat perfectly still on the edge of my bed. The digital recorder displayed a blinking red light, capturing every single word of their mutual destruction. "You knew," Rachel whispered, the horror evident in her trembling voice. "Of course I knew," Nathan shouted, his anger echoing through the hidden microphones. "I have known for months. I let you keep your little toy boy because it kept you distracted while I dealt with the real problems at the firm. But if you ever threaten me again, I will personally hand the financial logs of that fake clinic to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You will go to prison for wire fraud, embezzlement, and kidnapping, and your little boyfriend will be driving that Porsche right into federal property to visit you. We are in this together, Rachel. You are going to smile, you are going to pack your bags, and when the transfer clears on Friday, we are both getting on a private plane and never looking back. Now sit down and shut up." I reached out and pressed the stop button on the digital receiver. I pulled the earphones out, letting the silence of my bedroom wash over me. My heart was pounding with a dark, triumphant rhythm. I did not just have financial documents or circumstantial evidence anymore. I had the absolute smoking gun. I had them on tape screaming their confessions into the digital void. They had outlined the forgery, the offshore accounts, the fake medical facility, and the poisoning of my daughter. They had handed me the exact weapon I needed to execute them both. I carefully placed the digital recorder into the inside pocket of my jacket. I smiled in the darkness. Friday was going to be a complete bloodbath. Friday morning arrived with a cold, clear sky cutting through the lingering Texas humidity. I woke up before the sun even breached the horizon. I packed my small suitcase in the guest bedroom of the mansion, folding my clothes with meticulous, deliberate movements. I did not leave a note on the kitchen counter. I did not say goodbye. I simply walked out the heavy oak front door, pulling it shut with a quiet click, leaving the suffocating silence of the house behind me. Nathan and Rachel were still asleep in the master suite upstairs, dreaming of their imminent wealth, blissfully unaware that the ground beneath their feet had already completely eroded. I climbed into my truck and drove straight to the private clinic where Arthur had been treating my daughter. When I walked into the private recovery suite, my breath caught in my throat. I had to stop in the doorway just to take it all in. The fragile, broken woman I had carried out of that sweltering attic just days ago was entirely gone. In her place stood my brilliant daughter. Arthur and his team had worked a medical miracle with aggressive hydration and vitamin therapies, flushing the toxic sedatives completely out of her system. But it was not the medicine that had truly brought her back to life. It was the unmistakable fire burning in her eyes. She was standing in front of a tall, full-length mirror, dressed in a sharp, tailored navy blue power suit. It was the exact suit she used to wear when she ran my accounting department. It was the armor of a woman who commanded absolute respect. I walked up behind her and gently placed my hands on her shoulders, feeling the sturdy, confident posture she had reclaimed. She looked at my reflection in the glass and offered a small, cold smile. It was not a smile of joy. It was a smile of pure, calculated determination. I reached up and carefully helped her adjust the collar of her crisp white shirt, smoothing down the lapels of her dark jacket. "You look beautiful, sweetheart." I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. She turned around to face me, her posture perfectly straight. "I feel like myself again, Dad," she replied, her voice clear and strong. She looked incredibly sharp. She looked healthy. And most importantly, she looked absolutely lethal. The door to the suite swung open, interrupting our quiet moment. Harvey strode into the room, bringing a wave of ruthless corporate energy with him. He was wearing his signature charcoal suit, holding a heavy leather briefcase in his right hand. He adjusted his expensive silk tie before speaking to us directly. He offered Sarah a respectful nod, his eyes widening slightly at her remarkable transformation. "Welcome back to the land of the living, Aura," he said, his voice carrying a rare note of genuine warmth. "Are you ready to take out the trash?" Sarah nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "I have been ready for 4 years, Harvey. Let us finish this." Harvey set his heavy briefcase down on the sterile medical table and popped the brass latches. The sharp snap echoed loudly in the quiet room. Inside the briefcase were 12 thick black folders. These were the financial dossiers meticulously prepared by Harvey and his team of forensic accountants over the last 48 hours. He pulled the top folder out and opened it, laying it flat on the table for us to review. It was an absolute masterpiece of financial destruction. Harvey walked us through the contents page by damning page. He had compiled every single piece of the puzzle. There were copies of the original forged $10 million loan documents that Sarah had bravely hidden in the air ventilation ducts of her apartment 4 years ago before she was drugged and taken. And right at the very front of the binder, resting like a loaded weapon, was a certified transcript of the audio recording I had captured the night before. Harvey looked up from the documents, his eyes locking onto mine. He explained the strategy for the morning. We were not going to barge into the boardroom yelling and screaming. We were going to let Nathan dig his own grave. We were going to let him stand up in front of the most powerful investors in the city and present his fraudulent paperwork. We were going to let him commit corporate perjury in front of a dozen witnesses, and then we were going to trap him in that room and dismantle his entire life piece by agonizing piece. I slowly closed the heavy black folder and handed it back to Harvey. The dark anticipation settling in my chest was heavy and cold. We left the clinic together, walking down the long white corridor side by side. Sarah walked with a steady, confident stride, the sharp clicking of her heels echoing against the linoleum floor. It was the sound of an impending reckoning. We stepped out into the bright morning sunlight and climbed into the back of a tinted black town car Harvey had waiting for us at the curb. The drive into the city center was completely silent. No one even needed to speak. The battle lines had been drawn. I looked out the tinted window, watching the familiar glass and steel skyline of the financial district approach. Today, I knew I was going to lose a son forever. I had accepted that painful reality. But I was also going to save the massive legacy of my company, protect my dedicated employees, and I had finally saved my beautiful daughter from the darkness. We pulled into the underground parking garage of the corporate headquarters just before 9. The cold concrete pillars felt like the belly of a sleeping giant. I had poured my blood, sweat, and tears into building this corporation, and walking into it today felt exactly like entering a war zone. Harvey guided us directly to the private executive elevator, a highly restricted car bypassing the crowded main lobby. I used my master key card to activate the heavy steel doors. As we ascended, the only sound was the rhythmic hum of the thick cables. Sarah stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed forward. The doors slid open to the quiet executive suite. Harvey led us into my old private office, which shared a connecting wall with the main boardroom. I cracked the heavy mahogany door open just a fraction of an inch, allowing us to hear everything perfectly without being seen. I stood in the dark shadows, my heart beating with a slow, heavy rhythm. Through the narrow gap, I could see the massive oval conference table. The 12 members of the board of directors were already taking their respective seats. These seasoned investors and loyal colleagues were shuffling papers and quietly chatting, completely unaware of the massive ambush that was about to unfold before them. At exactly 9, the heavy double doors at the far end of the expansive boardroom swung open. Nathan confidently walked in. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his posture radiating an overwhelming, arrogant confidence. He carried the dark blue folder tucked securely under his left arm. He did not take his usual seat. Instead, he walked directly to the head of the long table, to the large leather chair that belonged exclusively to me. He stood behind it, resting his hands flat on the premium leather, surveying the quiet room with a smug sense of total ownership. The low hum of conversation around the table quickly died down. Nathan deliberately cleared his throat. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his smooth voice projecting easily. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. I know an emergency meeting today is unusual, but we have a deeply personal situation to address regarding the immediate leadership of this corporation." I watched the respected board members exchange deeply worried glances. As you all know, Nathan continued, suddenly adopting a very somber cadence. "My father has been the true heart of this company for 40 years. But time is a cruel master. Over the past few months, my wife and I have sadly watched his cognitive health rapidly deteriorate. It initially started with memory lapses, but has unfortunately escalated into severe confusion. The doctors confirmed he is suffering from aggressive dementia. It breaks my heart, but my father is no longer mentally capable of making rational decisions for a company of this vast magnitude." A collective gasp rippled quickly through the large boardroom. Several older board members shook their heads in genuine profound sorrow. Nathan paused, pretending to fight back a tear, playing the burdened son flawlessly. Sarah tensed up beside me, her fists clenched solid white. "Because of this tragic decline," Nathan said, his voice hardening slightly. "Now, my father and I had a difficult conversation last night. He officially decided to step down and enter permanent retirement. For his protection, he signed over complete executive authority to me." Nathan dramatically dropped the dark blue folder directly onto the center of the mahogany table. He flipped it open, revealing the pages I had signed with a trembling hand. "This is a general durable power of attorney, granting me immediate and total control over all corporate assets, financial restructuring, and executive decisions." The room remained completely silent. The stunned board members stared at the blue folder. Now Nathan said, his voice entirely replacing sorrow with sharp, aggressive authority. "Because I am now the acting chief executive, I spent the morning reviewing our internal financial structures. I discovered a catastrophic liability my father completely ignored in his declining state. The employee pension fund is severely overleveraged. If we do not act immediately, this company faces total insolvency. We are bleeding cash, and the pension fund is the anchor dragging us down. Therefore, my first official act is to demand an immediate board vote to liquidate the employee pension fund. We will move those $10 million into a secure offshore holding account to stabilize our operating costs. We truly need to vote on this right now before the banking institutions securely open." The audacity of his massive lie was absolutely breathtaking. He was framing me for the financial collapse, using my life legacy to cover his massive theft. The boardroom quickly erupted into total chaos. Several loyal members shouted in loud protest, aggressively demanding a formal audit. They refused to liquidate the life savings of the dedicated employees without first seeing the raw financial data. Nathan angrily slammed his fist down onto the table, his face turning dark red with violent anger. "There is absolutely no time for an audit," Nathan loudly roared, his true sinister nature finally bleeding right through his highly polished exterior. "I possess the strict legal authority to force this restructuring, but I am merely giving you the professional courtesy of a vote. If you do not boldly liquidate that exact fund right now, we will certainly lose everything we built. The critical papers are permanently signed. The final decision is completely irreversible. My senile father is completely gone, and I am firmly in charge here right now." I silently took a slow, deep, calming breath, standing in the dark executive office. I looked directly at my lawyer, Harvey. He gave me a sharp, highly decisive physical nod. I slowly reached my right hand out, and firmly grabbed the cold brass handle of the exceptionally heavy, solid mahogany door. The torturous psychological waiting game was finally over for my deeply corrupt and extremely arrogant son and his entirely criminal financial enterprise. It was finally time to strike back. I turned the heavy brass handle and pushed the solid mahogany door wide open. It swung outward with a deep, echoing thud that instantly silenced the entire boardroom. Every single head in the room snapped in my direction, eyes wide with utter disbelief. Nathan froze completely at the head of the massive oval table, his mouth still slightly open from his tyrannical speech. I stepped out of the dark shadows and walked directly into the bright fluorescent light of the main conference room. I did not shuffle my feet. I did not lean heavily on a wooden cane. I stood up perfectly straight, pulling my tired shoulders back and lifting my chin high. I walked slowly, measuring every single purposeful step, moving deliberately down the length of the long, polished table. The manufactured, pathetic tremor in my hands was completely gone. The vacant, confused stare of a weak old man suffering from severe dementia vanished entirely from my eyes. It was instantly replaced by the cold, highly calculating glare of a ruthless businessman who had built this sprawling corporate empire with his bare hands. I walked right past the deeply shocked faces of my oldest colleagues and my most trusted investors refusing to break my focused gaze. I finally stopped moving when I was standing directly across the table from my treacherous son. Nathan stared at me as if he were looking at a terrifying ghost. He swallowed hard, the arrogant color rapidly draining from his sun-tanned cheeks. "Dad," he stammered, his voice suddenly lacking all of its previous booming authority. "What are you doing here? You are supposed to be resting quietly at home. You are not well enough to be in this building." I completely ignored his pathetic attempt to maintain his crumbling narrative. I looked down at the dark blue folder resting prominently on the center of the wooden table. I reached out with a perfectly steady, unwavering hand, picked up the General Durable Power of Attorney document, and held it up high for the entire board of directors to see clearly. "My son just told you all that I signed away my entire life to him," I said, my voice projecting clearly and powerfully across the incredibly silent room. "He told you I am hopelessly senile, and that he is the only person who can possibly save this great company from financial ruin. But like absolutely everything else that comes out of his mouth, it is a complete malicious fabrication." I tossed the blue folder back onto the mahogany wood with a loud smack. "The document you are looking at is entirely legally void. If my supposedly competent son had actually bothered to consult a real corporate attorney instead of rushing blindly to steal my legacy, he would have easily noticed that the signature on those pages is deliberately flawed. It intentionally lacks my full legal middle name, and the standard loop on the letter H is completely broken. Combined with a sworn affidavit I officially filed yesterday morning, stating I was acting under severe duress, that piece of paper is nothing more than incredibly expensive garbage." The boardroom instantly erupted into a chaotic storm of furious whispers and shocked gasps. Nathan panicked wildly, aggressively slamming his hands down onto the top of the leather chair. "That is a ridiculous lie," he shouted loudly, his voice cracking terribly with sudden desperation. "He simply does not know what he is saying anymore. His mind is completely gone. Do not listen to him for another second." I reached deep into my tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a small black remote control. I aimed it directly at the ceiling receiver and pressed a single button. The mechanical hum of the projector motor filled the tense room as the massive white presentation screen slowly descended on the wall, directly behind Nathan. He turned around quickly, just as the exceptionally bright bulb flashed on. But the massive screen did not display the complicated financial charts or the pension fund liquidation plans he had eagerly prepared. Instead, a massive high-definition image of a classified bank statement appeared for everyone to witness. I looked directly at the stunned, open-mouthed investors. My son confidently claims the employee pension fund is over-leveraged simply because of my poor management. I stated firmly, pointing a steady finger at the glowing screen. The terrible truth is that exactly 4 years ago, Nathan deliberately forged my personal signature to illegally borrow $10 million against the vital retirement accounts of our hardworking employees. He lost absolutely all of it in unregulated cryptocurrency markets. And when he realized the federal auditors were finally closing in on him, he desperately tried to liquidate the entire remaining fund to cover his criminal tracks. I pressed the remote control button again. The image on the screen changed immediately. It now clearly displayed the corporate registration documents for the fake medical facility located in Switzerland. But the sickening theft did not stop there. I continued letting my voice ring out with pure righteous fury. To keep his massive crimes securely hidden, he and his wife Rachel devised a sickening extortion scheme. For 48 straight months, I have been blindly wiring $15,000 a month to a luxury psychiatric clinic in Geneva. Look closely at the screen. The clinic is a fake shell corporation securely registered in the Cayman Islands, solely owned by Rachel. I pressed the remote button a third time. The screen illuminated the room with vivid photographs of a brand new silver Porsche and a heavily muscled young personal trainer holding hands with Rachel. They used my money to fund a secret life of extreme luxury and disgusting infidelity, I stated coldly. The board members gasped in absolute horror. Nathan suddenly snapped completely. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. He lunged violently across the table toward the intercom system, frantically slamming his fist onto the plastic call button. "Security," he screamed. His desperate voice cracked sharply with sheer terror. Before his trembling finger could press the intercom button, Harvey stepped forward from the shadows of the executive suite. The corporate lawyer moved with terrifying speed, slamming his hand down onto the console and ripping the telephone cord out of the wall. "There will be no security today, Nathan," Harvey stated, his voice a dangerous rumble that echoed across the room. "You do not run this company. You are just a trespasser in this building." Nathan stumbled backward, his chest heaving as he looked around the massive oval table. He desperately searched for a single friendly face among the wealthy investors and senior directors. But the 12 men and women staring back at him saw a monster. The absolute disgust in their eyes was palpable. They had trusted him. They had mentored him. And he had tried to rob them blind to cover up his pathetic failures. Nathan wiped a bead of cold sweat from his forehead. "You are all being manipulated," he pleaded, his voice taking on a begging tone. "My father is completely delusional. He manufactured those documents. He hired someone to doctor those photographs. This is a hostile takeover driven by a sick, demented mind." He pointed a trembling finger at me. "He is trying to frame me because I am finally taking away his power." Just as the pathetic lies left his mouth, the heavy double doors at the far end of the boardroom slowly pushed open. Every head turned. It was Rachel. She was breathing heavily, clutching a designer handbag to her chest. Her eyes were completely bloodshot, her hair unkempt, a stark contrast to the perfectly polished socialite she usually portrayed. She had been consumed by the toxic seed of paranoia I had planted the morning before. Terrified that Nathan was finalizing the transfer to steal the $10 million and flee the country without her, she had followed him to the corporate headquarters. She stepped cautiously into the room, freezing, when she saw the massive high-definition projection screen illuminating the dark boardroom. She saw the registration documents for her fake Cayman Islands shell corporation. She saw the bright, undeniable photographs of the silver Porsche and her young personal trainer. The color completely vanished from her face. She looked like a woman stepping directly onto the gallows. "Rachel," Nathan hissed, his voice trembling with furious panic. "What in the world are you doing here? Get out of this room right now." Rachel ignored him completely. She stared at me, her eyes wide with absolute suffocating terror. She finally realized the depth of the trap they had blindly walked into. I did not break my unyielding gaze. I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored jacket and pulled out the small digital audio receiver I had used the night before. I walked calmly over to the central communication hub embedded in the mahogany table and plugged the small device directly into the boardroom surround sound speaker system. "You claim I am delusional, Nathan," I said, my voice cutting through the thick, suffocating tension like a freshly sharpened blade. "You claim I manufactured this evidence. Let us hear exactly what you and your devoted wife have to say about that." I pressed the play button on the receiver. For a fraction of a second, there was only the faint hiss of static. Then the crystal-clear audio of their vicious midnight argument exploded through the high-fidelity speakers, echoing off the glass walls of the boardroom. The entire room listened in horrified silence as Rachel's recorded voice shrieked about the $10 million in the Cayman Islands. They heard her explicitly detail how Nathan forged my legal signature on the vital pension loan documents. They heard her describe how Nathan had poisoned his own sister to cover up his massive financial crimes. And then they heard Nathan's cruel, venomous response. The speakers broadcasted his ruthless confession to the entire executive board. They heard him explicitly admit to running a quiet audit on his own wife. They heard his vicious threats to expose her fake Swiss clinic and her pathetic affair with the young personal trainer. The audio recording concluded with Nathan threatening to hand her over to the federal authorities and leave her completely alone to rot in federal prison for kidnapping while he escaped on a private plane. I reached down and pressed the stop button. The sudden silence in the boardroom was incredibly heavy, practically vibrating with the devastating weight of the undeniable truth. The investors sat paralyzed in their expensive leather chairs. The definitive proof of their massive corporate treason and sickening domestic abuse had just been played aloud for everyone to witness. There was absolutely no room left for lies, no corner left for them to hide in. Rachel snapped. The recording confirmed her absolute worst fears. Her husband had never planned to save her. He had fully intended to throw her to the wolves to save himself. She dropped her handbag, unleashing a guttural scream of pure rage. "You disgusting liar," she shrieked, launching herself across the room at Nathan. She slammed her fists into his chest, her nails tearing frantically at his charcoal suit. "You were going to leave me to take the fall for your sick crimes. You forced me to lock her in the attic. You told me it was the only way we could survive." Nathan stumbled backward under the sudden assault, desperately trying to grab her wrists. "Shut your mouth, you stupid woman," he roared back, dropping his polished corporate facade. "You gladly took the money. You bought the sports cars and jewelry. You are just as guilty as I am." The ultimate alliance of thieves had finally broken. They stood right in front of the horrified executive board, viciously tearing each other to pieces, screaming their darkest confessions into the cold air, while their entire fraudulent financial empire burned completely and violently to the ground. The chaotic spectacle of their vicious physical altercation left the entire boardroom paralyzed. The 12 senior directors and wealthy investors watched in absolute stunned silence as the immaculate veneer of Nathan and Rachel shattered into a pathetic display of primal violence. Harvey finally stepped forward, grabbing Nathan by the shoulder and forcefully shoving him back against the heavy leather chair. He ordered them both to sit down and shut up. Rachel collapsed into the nearest empty seat, burying her face in her trembling hands, weeping loudly, as the reality of her ruined life finally crushed her. But Nathan refused to sit. His chest heaved as he straightened his torn suit jacket. His face was scratched. His tie was ripped, but his eyes still darted around the room with the frantic, desperate energy of a cornered predator. He looked at the disgusted faces of the board members, realizing that his personal reputation was completely destroyed. The extortion, the fake clinic, the affair, those were terrible personal scandals. But Nathan was a sociopath who only cared about the corporate power. He knew that if he could just cast doubt on the financial forgery, if he could just maintain the illusion of his executive authority, he might still be able to salvage the millions of dollars and escape. He wiped the sweat from his brow and turned his manic gaze back toward me. He pointed a shaking finger at the projection screen, completely ignoring the weeping woman sitting just a few feet away from him. "You can play all the illegally obtained audio recordings you want," he sneered, his voice dropping into a raspy, desperate growl. "You can parade my wife's pathetic infidelity in front of this entire company. I do not care about her, and I do not care about that stupid fake clinic. But you cannot prove a single thing about the pension fund loan." He slammed his hand on the table, trying to project a dominance he no longer possessed. "That audio recording proves absolutely nothing about my financial actions. It is just a hysterical woman making wild accusations during a domestic dispute. Where is your actual proof, Dad? Where is the physical evidence that I forged your signature 4 years ago? You do not have it because it does not exist. I signed that loan with your full authorization, and the bank approved it. The original documents were securely filed and legally verified." He took a step forward, his arrogant smirk slowly returning as he thought he had found the fatal flaw in my trap. "You are trying to convict me of corporate fraud based on nothing but a lover's quarrel. The only person in this entire world who ever claimed there was a discrepancy with that loan was Sarah. And we all know exactly what happened to her. She is a certified lunatic. She had a massive psychotic break. Her medical records have been heavily documented by multiple doctors for the last 4 years. She is completely, legally incompetent." Nathan looked around the oval table, desperately trying to appeal to the board members' logic. "Think about it," he pleaded, spreading his hands wide. "Are you really going to destroy my career and liquidate this company based on the supposed testimony of a woman who belongs in a padded cell? Even if she was standing in this room right now, no judge in this country would ever believe a single word she said. But she is not here, is she?" He let out a dark, triumphant laugh that echoed sickeningly against the glass walls. "She ran away. She completely snapped. Just late last night, broke out of her room and vanished into the streets like a wild animal. She is probably wandering around right now, completely out of her mind. She is a ghost. You have absolutely no witness, Dad. You have no physical proof of forgery. You have a bunch of gossip and avoided power of attorney. I am still the rightful heir to this empire, and you are just a bitter old man trying to ruin my life because your brain is rotting away." He crossed his arms over his chest, standing tall at the head of the boardroom table, practically daring me to refute his final desperate argument. I did not say a word. I simply stood there, looking at the pathetic, arrogant boy I had raised. I let the heavy silence stretch out for a long, agonizing moment. I waited until his smug smile reached its absolute peak. Then I slowly shifted my gaze away from his face and looked directly past his shoulder, staring intently at the heavy double doors positioned at the far end of the executive boardroom. Every single board member followed my eyes. Nathan frowned, his triumphant expression faltering as he slowly turned his head to look behind him. For a brief second, the room was so quiet I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock. Then the heavy brass handles of the boardroom doors slowly pressed downward. The thick wooden panels swung open with a smooth, deliberate motion. The bright morning light from the reception corridor flooded into the dim conference room. Standing perfectly centered in the doorway was the ghost Nathan had just confidently mocked. Sarah stepped forward into the boardroom. She did not look like a broken prisoner. She did not look like a trembling victim escaping an asylum. She looked like an absolute titan. She wore her sharp navy blue power suit, her posture incredibly straight, her eyes locked onto her brother with a terrifying, icy focus. Every single investor at the table gasped in profound shock. Nathan physically stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the leather chair. His mouth opened, but he could not produce a single sound. Sarah walked slowly and purposefully down the length of the room. In her right hand, she carried a thick yellowed envelope. It was the original fully forged loan document she hid 4 long years ago. The rhythmic clicking of her heels against the polished mahogany floor sounded like the heavy tolling of a funeral bell. She did not rush. She moved with the steady, undeniable grace of a woman who had survived absolute hell and returned to claim her rightful throne. The wealthy investors and senior directors parted instinctively as she passed them, their eyes wide with a mixture of profound awe and deep, unsettling horror. They remembered the brilliant, vibrant accountant she used to be, and they were finally seeing the sheer strength it took to survive the darkness her own family had condemned her to. Nathan remained completely frozen at the head of the conference table. His knuckles were bone white as he gripped the edge of the leather chair. His arrogant posture had completely collapsed, leaving him looking like a terrified child caught in a massive, inescapable lie. Sarah stopped directly in front of him. She did not raise her voice. She did not scream or cry. She simply raised her right hand and let the thick yellowed envelope drop heavily onto the center of the table. The dull thud echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. She looked him directly in the eyes, her gaze as cold and unforgiving as a winter storm. "I am fully sane, brother," she said, her voice perfectly steady and clear. "And I am here to take my company back." Nathan stared at the faded envelope as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. His mouth opened and closed several times, but his vocal cords refused to produce a single sound. He slowly reached out a trembling hand, his fingers hovering just inches above the thick paper. He knew exactly what was inside. It was the undeniable proof of his corporate treason, the original documents bearing the forged signature he had so desperately tried to bury. He looked up at Sarah, his eyes pleading silently for a mercy he had never once shown her during those 4 agonizing years of captivity. But there was no mercy left in this room. One of the senior board members, a man who had worked alongside me for over 30 years, leaned forward and carefully opened the envelope. He pulled out the crisp, undeniable pages of the fraudulent $10 million loan. He recognized my authentic signature instantly, and he immediately saw the sloppy, rushed forgery Nathan had attempted to pass off as legitimate. The board member looked up at Nathan, his face contorted into an expression of absolute disgust. "You are a complete disgrace," he whispered, sliding the damning evidence across the table for the rest of the investors to see clearly. The entire executive board began to murmur in shocked, angry agreement. The impenetrable fortress Nathan thought he had built around himself was crumbling to dust right before his eyes. The sheer weight of his complete destruction finally crushed the last remaining shreds of his sanity. Nathan let out a desperate guttural sound, a pathetic whine that belonged to a cornered animal. He abruptly shoved the heavy leather chair backward, sending it crashing violently into the glass wall behind him. He spun around, his eyes frantically scanning the room for an escape route. He abandoned all pretense of innocence, completely abandoning his weeping wife Rachel, who was still curled in her chair, sobbing uncontrollably. He lunged awkwardly toward the main reception doors, his expensive leather shoes slipping desperately on the polished hardwood floor. He was a coward running from the consequences of his own monstrous greed. But before he could even take 3 desperate steps toward freedom, Harvey smoothly stepped into his path. The corporate lawyer did not flinch. He simply reached out and firmly grasped the brass handle of the private executive side door, the one connecting the boardroom directly to my old office. "You are not going anywhere today," Nathan Harvey stated coldly, pulling the heavy door wide open. The bright light from the adjacent office spilled into the room, revealing the figures who had been waiting patiently in the shadows. 2 grim-faced police detectives stepped forward into the boardroom, their silver badges gleaming sharply against their dark suits. Right behind the detectives stood Dr. Arthur Evans, holding a thick medical file containing the devastating toxicology reports, proving my daughter had been systematically poisoned. The trap had officially snapped shut, from every single conceivable angle. The lead detective stepped swiftly past Harvey, reaching out to grab Nathan by the shoulder of his torn charcoal suit. He spun the terrified traitor around forcefully, shoving him face first against the polished surface of the expensive mahogany table. The sudden violent movement sent corporate documents scattering into the air. Nathan gasped in pain as his cheek was smashed against the cold wood. "You are under arrest for kidnapping, forgery, and wire fraud," the detective announced, his stern voice carrying clearly across the silent boardroom. The metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. The second detective walked quickly toward the far side of the table, approaching the weeping, trembling figure of Rachel. She did not even attempt to run or fight. She simply held out her shaking hands, tears streaming down her ruined face as the cold metal clamped tightly around her wrists as well. She was arrested for her direct role in the sickening extortion scheme and the false medical imprisonment. They were forcefully marched through the center of the room. The wealthy elites of the city watched the humiliation unfold in silence. They were exposed as absolute monsters, stripped of their power, their dignity, and their freedom, in front of everyone they knew. I stood proudly beside my daughter, feeling a profound sense of justice wash over my soul. Sarah placed her warm hand gently over mine. We watched the double doors close behind them, finally sealing their dark chapter forever. The final checkmate was complete. The days that followed the boardroom confrontation were a whirlwind of legal devastation. The arrest of a prominent corporate executive and his socialite wife sent immediate shockwaves through the financial district and the local media. News helicopters circled the sprawling estate I had once proudly purchased for them. But there was no pride left, only the cold, sterile mechanics of the justice system dismantling their lives. The authorities conducted a massive raid on the mansion, uncovering the horrific conditions in the attic. They photographed the broken window, the heavy steel chain, the blood I had carefully staged, and the dozens of empty prescription bottles. The physical evidence of the suffering of my daughter was now a matter of public record, completely destroying any lingering shred of credibility for Nathan. He was denied bail. He was deemed a massive flight risk due to the offshore accounts and the severity of his crimes. Rachel was also remanded into federal custody, stripped of her designer clothes, and forced into a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The reality of her situation hit her with the force of a freight train. She was no longer the untouchable queen of the country club. She was a federal inmate facing decades behind bars. Desperation breeds a very specific kind of cowardice. Within 48 hours of her arrest, the expensive defense attorney representing Rachel desperately contacted the district attorney. She wanted to cut a plea deal. She offered to turn into a state witness, promising to testify against Nathan in open court. She claimed she was merely a victim of his psychological manipulation, a terrified wife who had been forced into compliance. She offered to hand over all the passwords to the Cayman Islands accounts, provided they dropped the kidnapping charges, and offered her a reduced sentence in a minimum security facility. When Harvey brought me this information, I felt a familiar, sickening surge of anger. She was trying to slip through the cracks, trying to use her husband as a human shield, just as he had planned to use her. But I was not about to let either of them escape the full weight of their actions. I told Harvey to crush her deal. We did not need her testimony to secure a conviction, and I refused to let her trade the suffering of my daughter for a lighter sentence. Harvey and I sat down with the lead prosecutor. We handed over a mountain of irrefutable evidence. We provided the forensic financial audits, the toxicology reports from Arthur, the original forged loan documents Sarah had preserved, and the crystal-clear audio recording of their mutual confessions. The recording explicitly proved Rachel was a willing and active participant, deeply involved in the extortion, and fully aware of the illegal sedation. The prosecutor listened to the tape and immediately revoked the plea offer. There would be no deals, no leniency, and absolutely no mercy for either of them. They were both charged with first-degree kidnapping, massive corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and severe medical battery. The sheer volume of evidence was so overwhelming that their defense attorneys eventually advised them to plead guilty to avoid a brutal, highly publicized trial that would likely result in life sentences. The judge showed no sympathy during the sentencing hearing. He looked down from his bench and delivered the maximum allowable penalties under federal law. Nathan was sentenced to 25 years in a maximum security penitentiary. Rachel was given 20 years. They were both permanently ruined, but the criminal convictions were only the beginning of their punishment. The financial devastation was equally absolute. Because the crimes involved massive corporate fraud and extortion, the federal government immediately froze and seized every single asset connected to their names. The bank swiftly foreclosed on the sprawling mansion in Lincoln Park, auctioning it off to the highest bidder to recoup the stolen corporate funds. The luxury vehicles, including the brand-new silver Porsche she had bought for her young lover, were confiscated and sold. The young personal trainer, terrified of being implicated in a federal wire fraud conspiracy, completely abandoned Rachel, refusing to even accept her collect calls from the county jail. The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands were aggressively drained by international authorities and returned to the pension fund of my company. Nathan and Rachel were stripped of absolutely everything. Their bank accounts were zeroed out. Their credit was obliterated. Their social standing was reduced to a cautionary tale whispered at dinner parties. They had spent 4 years stealing from me and torturing my daughter to build an empire of sand, and I had washed it all away in a single morning. A week before Nathan was scheduled to be transferred to the federal penitentiary, I arranged a final visit at the county holding facility. I walked through the heavy metal detectors and down the bleak concrete corridors. The air smelled of bleach and despair. I sat down in a small, sterile visitation booth separated by a thick pane of reinforced glass. A heavy steel door opened on the other side, and a guard escorted my son into the room. He was handcuffed, shuffling slowly in his bright orange uniform. He looked completely defeated. He had lost significant weight, his face pale and drawn his eyes hollow. He sat down heavily in the metal chair and picked up the black telephone receiver. I picked up my receiver, looking at him through the smudged glass. We stared at each other for a long moment. "Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking with genuine pathetic fear. "Please, you have to help me. I will not survive 25 years in there. You are my father. Please forgive me." I looked at the boy I had raised, the boy who had chained his own sister to a pipe and stolen the futures of my employees. I felt no anger left in my heart. I felt no sorrow. I felt absolutely nothing at all. "Goodbye, Nathan," I whispered coldly. I slowly stood up from the cold metal chair, placed the black receiver gently back onto its cradle, and turned away without ever looking back. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind me completely, severing the final tie I had to the monster I once called my son. I walked out of the holding facility and finally stepped directly into the warm Texas sunlight. The crushing weight of deceit and betrayal had finally been lifted from my tired shoulders. The empire I built was safe, but more importantly, my family was finally free of the rot that almost consumed us from the inside out. Exactly 6 peaceful months passed since that explosive morning in the boardroom. The corporate transition was remarkably smooth. Once the toxic anchor of that severe mismanagement was severed, the company practically healed itself. But the true healing happened within the walls of my own home. Sarah moved back into her old room, bringing life and laughter back to the empty halls. Her recovery was nothing short of miraculous. The dark circles faded from under her eyes, replaced by the sharp, vibrant spark of the brilliant woman she was always meant to be. On a bright Monday morning, I gathered the board of directors one last time. I stood at the head of the mahogany table, not as a senile victim, but as a proud father passing the torch. I officially stepped down from my long-held role as the chief executive officer, immediately transferring the absolute legal control of the massive company directly to Sarah. She confidently took the large leather seat at the head of the table, looking incredibly powerful and focused in her tailored navy blue suit. The entire executive board immediately erupted into loud, genuine applause. They deeply respected her brilliant mind. They respected her miraculous survival, and they knew the legacy was in the strongest hands possible. I watched her command the room with absolute grace, and my heart swelled with a pride I could barely contain. But there was one final debt I needed to settle before I could truly embrace my retirement. I drove my old truck out to the modest, densely populated working-class neighborhood, located on the far edge of the city. I pulled up to a small, cramped apartment building, where Maria, the hard-working cleaner, who had unwittingly saved the life of my daughter, lived with her 3 young children. I knocked on the chipped wooden door. When Maria opened it, her eyes widened in surprise. "Mr. Thomas," she said quickly, wiping her hands on her apron. "I am so sorry. I did not know you were coming." I smiled warmly, holding a thick manila envelope in my hands. "Maria," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "you made a phone call that changed the entire course of my life. You risked your job and your safety because you knew something was terribly wrong. You saved my little girl from the absolute darkness." Maria shook her head, tears welling up in her kind eyes. "I just did what anyone would do, Mr. Thomas." I told her that was simply not true. Most people look away. Most people pretend they do not hear the crying. But she did not. I handed her the heavy envelope. Inside were the official property deeds, fully paid and securely registered in her name for a beautiful 4-bedroom house in a quiet, safe suburban neighborhood with an excellent school district. There was also a check large enough to furnish every room and send her children to college. She opened the envelope, reading the documents with trembling hands. When the reality of the gift finally washed over her, she collapsed into my arms, weeping with profound joy. It was the best investment I had ever made in my entire life. I drove back to my quiet porch, sitting in my old leather armchair, as the Texas sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. The silence of the evening was deeply comforting. I poured myself a tall glass of sweet iced tea, quietly reflecting on the brutal storm we had just successfully weathered together. People often assume that blood is the absolute ultimate bond. They believe that sharing a last name automatically entitles someone to your trust, your money, and your unconditional protection. But I learned the hardest lesson a father can ever learn. Blood is nothing more than a biological coincidence. True family is forged in the fires of loyalty, respect, and mutual sacrifice. The people who truly deserve your love are the ones who stand by you when the world turns dark, not the vultures who wait in the shadows for you to fall. I gave my son everything a father could possibly give, and he repaid that boundless generosity with unspeakable cruelty. He mistook my paternal devotion for foolishness. He mistook my quiet aging for vulnerability. But as he sits in a concrete cell tonight, completely stripped of his name and his fortune, I hope he finally understands his fatal mistake. Never mistake the love of an old man for weakness. We spend our entire lives building the world around us, and if we have to, we possess the terrifying strength to tear it all down to protect the people who actually matter. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my deeply personal story today. I hope it gives you the courage to stand up against anyone who tries to take advantage of your kindness, even if they share your blood. Please let me know down in the comments below which specific part of this massive downfall was your absolute favorite. Please do not forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you believe that justice always prevails in the end. Until we meet again next time, please remember to stay strong. Always trust your deepest instincts and fiercely protect the members of your true family.